He never raised his voice. He never stood up. He didn't need to. It was the steam from his coffee cup that trembled first, a tiny ripple on a formica table at the edge of a half-empty diner in East Baltimore. Rain painted the window like a curtain that refused to lift. Outside, cars passed without urgency. Inside, it smelled of bacon grease and yesterday's apologies. Elijah's coat was 2 winters too old. His boots held the weight of desserts and silence. No one knew his name. That was the safest way to live. The waitress offered refills without asking questions. That morning, like most, he traded warmth for invisibility. But when the bell over the door chimed and 2 officers stepped in, one smirking, the other already scanning, the quiet shifted. There was a different kind of cold in the air now, the kind that didn't come from outside. Elijah didn't move, didn't blink, just reached slowly into his coat and placed an old flip phone on the table. Not everyone who's quiet is powerless, and not every man in rags is alone. The cold had a rhythm that morning, soft, persistent, almost polite in the way it clung to exposed skin. Dawn barely broke through the grey that covered East Baltimore like an old blanket. Everything felt slow. Cars crawled past the fogged windows of Murphy's diner, their headlights smearing across the glass like tired eyes refusing to wake. Inside, the warmth wasn't just from the ancient heater in the corner. It came from the ritual, mugs being rinsed, bacon popping on the grill, the shuffle of stools against the linoleum floor. There was comfort in the ordinary. Elijah had taken his seat before the first pot of coffee finished brewing. He always chose the booth furthest from the door where the wall met the window. The corner gave him 3 advantages: a clear view, a backrest, and space for no one else to sit. His coat, once military issue, was now threadbare at the elbows and darkened from years of rain. Beneath it, a flannel shirt clung to his frame, hinting at the muscle that used to fill it. The waitress Linda knew better than to offer a menu. She simply nodded and poured the coffee. He nodded back, nothing more. Elijah didn't speak much. Not here, not anywhere. Words had once been tools, commands, codes, last wishes. Now they felt like weapons, and he'd seen enough of those. As he cupped the coffee with both hands, the steam rising felt like a kind of baptism. A moment of calm. He had no place to be, no one expecting him, and no version of the future that involved anything beyond surviving today. But survival came with memory. That was the curse. Flashbacks didn't wait for permission. Sometimes, the clink of a spoon on porcelain could send him back to a desert outpost where metal meant shrapnel. Other times, it was the smell of burnt toast that triggered the heat of a downed Humvee. He didn't fight the memories anymore. He let them wash over him, then recede. Outside, a patrol car idled across the street. He saw it reflected in the glass. His fingers tightened around the mug. To them, he was probably just another problem waiting to be contained. A body in the wrong place, wearing the wrong skin, carrying invisible weight they couldn't imagine and didn't care to understand. He didn't fear them, but he feared what they might try to provoke. There was no drama, no outburst, just a slow drip of dread, the kind you only recognize when you've lived long enough to know how things can unravel. Elijah had been housed before, had worn suits, sat in offices, even taught others how to lead. But the system has many exits, and some of them are hidden inside medals and discharge papers. He had taken one without knowing. Now, years later, he was a man with no fixed address, but infinite coordinates of loss. The waitress returned with a plate, scrambled eggs, toast, a few slices of ham. She placed it gently in front of him, her eyes soft but guarded. Elijah gave her a barely there smile. That was enough. As he ate, the door opened. The chime was ordinary, but everything else shifted. 2 officers stepped in, one tall with squared shoulders, the other younger, eyes scanning like radar. They didn't speak to each other, they didn't need to. Their uniforms did the talking. Elijah didn't look at them directly. He just kept eating, slow, controlled, like a man who's learned how to swallow rage with breakfast. He didn't know them, but he knew their type, and he had a feeling this morning wouldn't end quietly. They didn't walk, they patrolled. Even inside the diner, their steps had a measured rhythm, boots thudding against the floor like punctuation marks in a sentence that hadn't been written yet. The tall one led, scanning each booth with performative alertness. The younger officer followed, his hand resting near his belt like a reflex honed in classrooms and not in consequence. Elijah didn't flinch. His fork moved with the same rhythm. Scrambled eggs, bite, sip of coffee, another bite. Linda looked up from behind the counter, already tense. She wasn't afraid of them exactly, but she understood the rules of tension, how one wrong glance could start something no one could take back. The officers didn't order. They didn't greet anyone. They stopped 2 booths away from Elijah. "You planning to pay for that?" The taller one's voice was loud enough to draw attention, but not loud enough to count as aggressive. It was the kind of question that pretended to be a courtesy. It wasn't. Elijah met his eyes for the first time. Not with defiance, just silence, and something older than both officers combined. Fatigue dressed as patience. Linda cleared her throat. "He pays." "Always does." The younger officer's lip curled slightly. "We've had reports." Elijah blinked once, then again. "Of what?" The older one shrugged. "Loitering, panhandling, causing discomfort to paying customers." There were only 6 people in the diner. None had complained. None were even watching now, but all were listening. Elijah set his fork down. "You get those reports from ghosts?" The young one stepped closer. "Mind standing up for us, sir?" "Sir," that false courtesy again. Linda stepped forward. "Officers, he's been sitting there quiet all morning. He eats here. He doesn't bother anyone." The tall one didn't turn to her. "Ma'am, we've got procedures." Elijah didn't move. "I'm not standing." A pause. Small, heavy. The diner seemed to breathe in and hold it. "What's your name?" the young one asked, hand still close to his belt. Elijah leaned back in his seat. "I earned 3 names in my life. You don't need any of them." The tall officer's eyes narrowed. "You're refusing to comply?" "I'm refusing to perform." That was the moment it shifted. Not loud, not sharp. But the younger officer placed a hand fully on his taser, not drawing, just resting, and in doing so made it real. Elijah didn't blink. "You know what this looks like," the taller one said. "Homeless man, suspicious behavior, uncooperative, just need one reason." "Then you'll have to fabricate it," Elijah said, voice still low, "like you've been trained." The words didn't come from rage. They came from a place beyond it, from a history he didn't owe them, a burden they couldn't carry. And for the first time, the younger cop hesitated. There was something in Elijah's eyes that didn't match the stereotype. It wasn't fear. It was knowing. Linda looked between them, heart in her throat. "Can I use the phone?" Elijah asked her calmly. She nodded, stepping back, unsure of what he meant. But Elijah didn't touch the diner's landline. He reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, every movement designed to show restraint, and placed an old flip phone on the table. He flipped it open, pressed one button. The officers watched, unsure. "Who are you calling?" the tall one asked. Elijah looked up, eyes quiet and unmoved. "Someone who outranks you." The line clicked. It rang once, then twice. The silence in the diner had never been louder. The phone stopped ringing. A click, then a voice, gravelly, low, unmistakably authoritative. "Elijah, you all right?" The tone didn't match the tension in the diner. It sounded like a call between old friends or comrades, the kind of bond welded in fire, not forged through titles, the kind of voice that makes uniforms pause. Elijah didn't answer right away. He turned the phone slightly on the table, enough for both officers to hear the voice on the other end. "I'm in a diner on McElderry," Elijah said, slow and controlled. "Just trying to finish breakfast." A beat. "Someone bothering you?" "Yes." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was sharp. Then the voice on the phone shifted, still calm, but no longer friendly. It took on a clipped tone of institutional command. "Put one of them on." The taller officer straightened, unsure. "Who the hell is this?" Elijah didn't move. "Take the call." Reluctantly, the officer picked up the phone. "Yeah, this is Officer Gerald." Whatever he heard next changed the way he stood. His spine straightened. His mouth tightened. The confidence drained from his eyes in slow, visible increments. He didn't speak for a full 20 seconds, just listened, blinked, swallowed, listened more. Then, "Yes, sir." Understood. Right away. He handed the phone back like it was made of heat. Elijah didn't take it immediately. He looked at the younger officer, who was still frozen, confusion written across his face. "Your turn," Elijah said. The young cop hesitated. "Who is that?" Elijah finally answered. "General Marcus Holloway, Department of Defense, retired. National Security Advisor to the last 2 presidents." The room shifted again, but not with sound and with gravity, the kind of silence that exposes who knows what power really is. The younger cop took the phone with a shaking hand. "Yes, sir?" Another long pause. Another lesson being taught quietly over a speaker held with trembling fingers. He nodded, murmured a string of "yes, sir," and finally lowered the phone. I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Elijah cut in, reclaiming the phone and folding it shut. There was no bravado, no triumph, just a reassertion of dignity, laid bare without spectacle. Linda watched from behind the counter, her hands still on a coffee pot she forgot to pour. The other diners sat stunned, unsure whether to speak or stay invisible. "Mr. Gray," the taller officer began, attempting to recover. "We had no intention—" "I know exactly what your intentions were," Elijah said, voice colder now. "You don't get to rewrite the scene after you fail the test." The young officer looked down, shame mixing with confusion. "You were in the military." "I am the military," Elijah said, not out of ego but memory. "You saw a coat and made a call. I've worn medals bigger than your badge." He didn't need to stand to tower over them. "Next time," Elijah added, "ask questions before you assume answers." The older officer nodded stiffly. "Understood." They turned to leave. No apology, just retreat. Not out of respect, but recognition of a boundary they hadn't expected. As the door shut behind them, the diner exhaled. Linda approached slowly. "Elijah." "Who was that, really?" "Friend," he said. "Owes me his life." She stared at him. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because I shouldn't have to." He picked up his fork again, the eggs now cold. It didn't matter. Outside, the rain had stopped, but something else had begun. They didn't come back. The patrol car that had idled across the street was gone within minutes, its absence leaving behind a kind of echo, the lingering weight of something almost violent, almost irreversible. Elijah watched through the glass, not for confirmation, but for ritual. He needed to see them leave, not because he feared their return, but because departure was part of the healing. Inside, the diner was unnaturally still. Then came the whispers, quiet, cautious, questions wrapped in disbelief. A man in the corner booth adjusted his glasses and leaned in toward his wife, murmuring, "Did he say General Holloway?" A young server paused mid-step, tray in hand, eyes wide as she stared at the folded phone like it was holy. Linda refilled Elijah's coffee without asking. "You want it reheated?" she offered, her voice softer now. "It's fine cold," Elijah replied. The coffee was bitter but familiar, like the years between who he was and who he had become. He could feel the shift in the room. No longer invisible, no longer the old man at the edge of the diner with a military coat and tired eyes. Now, he was the man who'd silenced police with one phone call, the man whose presence raised questions no one was brave enough to ask out loud. But Elijah didn't need their awe. He wasn't a myth. He was a man. And he'd paid the cost for that phone call, in blood, in lost friends, in years spent waking to dreams that felt too real to be memories. It had been 5 years since he'd spoken to Holloway, 10 since they'd last seen each other, in a tent at the edge of a conflict no one in the US cared to remember. But bonds forged in silence are the strongest, and some men don't forget the ones who pulled them out of fire. Elijah had saved the general's life under direct gunfire. Holloway had promised, "If you ever need me, anything, I'll answer." Elijah never used that card until today. He didn't feel proud, he felt vindicated, and that was quieter, heavier. Linda sat across from him now, something she'd never done before. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Elijah nodded. "Why'd you wait? Why not stop them the second they started? He stirred the coffee slowly, letting the silence stretch. Because sometimes people need to reveal who they really are, he said. If I'd spoken too soon, they could have said I imagined it. If I let them keep talking, they exposed themselves. She nodded slowly. That was smart. Brave. He shook his head. No. Just necessary. The door opened again. Everyone in the diner turned, but it was just a man with an umbrella and a child. Normalcy returned like a tide coming back in. Still, the atmosphere remained changed, like a room where something sacred had just happened. The young officer returned alone. Elijah clocked him immediately in the reflection of his coffee. He approached the booth, hat in hand now, posture humble. "I'm sorry," he said. Elijah didn't respond. The officer stood there, uncomfortable. "I mean that. You didn't deserve how we approached you, and I didn't know." "That's the problem," Elijah interrupted. "You never know, because you don't ask. You just assume that your fear is more important than my humanity." The young man swallowed hard. "I'll remember this." "I hope so." He left again. No badge, no radio. Just shame walking on 2 feet. Elijah finished his breakfast in silence, paid in cash, left a tip that nearly matched the bill. As he stood, the room watched but didn't move. He didn't nod, didn't wave. Just walked out the door the same as he came. Except now the world had seen him. The street had dried into a mosaic of wet shadows and morning sun. Elijah stepped into it quietly, the weight of the diner falling off his shoulders like steam from a mug, left untouched too long. He walked without hurry, each step steady, deliberate, not out of pride, but balance. A man used to scanning rooftops, reading silence, counting exits, habits that never left. The streets of East Baltimore didn't apologize. They never had. Cracks in the sidewalk stayed cracked. Trash danced in corners untouched by sanitation routes. And faces, black, tired, surviving, moved through the city like they were part of its infrastructure. A young man passed him on a bike, headphones in, hoodie up. He didn't look twice, that was fine. Elijah wasn't interested in recognition. He'd had enough of that in his first life. The one with the medals, the citations, the speeches. They all faded eventually. Only the moments stayed, the ones you didn't talk about. He reached a bench outside a closed community center and sat. From his pocket he pulled the flip phone. It was scratched, the antenna bent slightly. No one used these anymore. That was why he did. Less noise, fewer distractions, fewer chances to be tracked. He opened it again. No new messages. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He took out a pen from the inside of his coat and wrote on the back of a receipt. "There's always a line. Know when to cross it." He folded it carefully and tucked it under the bench. Maybe someone would find it, maybe no one would, but sometimes messages are meant for the air. Back at the diner, things were already resetting. Linda would wipe the table and pour the next round of coffee. The eggs would sizzle again. The officers would file a report that omitted the phone call. And someone, maybe the couple in the corner, maybe the kid by the jukebox, would tell the story differently with pieces missing or colored in, but the core would remain: a black man, alone, harassed, silent, until he wasn't. There was no media, no hashtags, no crowd gathered to film. There was only a choice, a call, a truth laid bare, and a quiet, heavy dignity that couldn't be revoked. Elijah leaned back and closed his eyes. His body ached in familiar places. His past whispered in familiar tones. But the air was different now. He had walked away from battles louder than this, but few as necessary. Some battles are never televised. They happen in silence, between a coffee cup and a badge, between memory and assumption, between a man who's seen too much and a world that still sees him as less. Elijah was never asking for sympathy. He didn't need it. What he needed, what so many like him need, is room to exist without suspicion, to walk into a diner and be tired without becoming a threat, to wear the weight of his service without having to prove it, over and over again. What happened that morning wasn't heroic. It was human, a reminder that power isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner booth, watching, waiting, deciding whether this is the day to speak. The phone call wasn't a rescue, it was a reckoning. A reminder that some men carry stories too heavy for strangers to hold, and that sometimes the only proof of your worth is the name in your contact list and the voice on the other end. The officers will remember Elijah, maybe not for his medals, maybe not for his calm, but for the way he didn't flinch when everything told him to. And the rest of the world? It may never know what happened inside that diner, but someone somewhere will carry this story, whisper it to a friend, repeat it in pieces, let it grow roots. Because dignity doesn't need a spotlight, it needs witness. The world is full of Elijahs, men and women who've been reduced to silence until the moment they choose not to be. If this story stayed with you, sit with it a little longer. Let it echo in places you don't usually go, and if it reminds you of someone you've overlooked, look again. They may be carrying more than you'll ever understand.